It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. It is Monday, March 4th. I am Tia Graham.
And I'm Nick Austin. Today on the program, Tia, a newly released study looks at the numbers behind the racial wealth gap, and we'll discuss the findings with an economist behind the study later in the show.
But first, on the Metro, the spoken word can communicate so many messages, from love to strife, from compassion to fear and anger. The spoken word can fill you with unspoken emotions. The InsideOut Literary Arts program, for the second year in a row, is presenting its annual Detroit Youth Poetry Con. And since 1995, the InsideOut's goal has been to transform lives through written and spoken word. This year's event will take place this Saturday, March 9th, all day at Wayne State University Student Center. You'll also learn a little bit more because our guest is here to tell us more. Joining us on the Metro is Suma Karaman Rosen. Suma is Executive Director of the InsideOut Literary Arts program. I want to say thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Awesome. It's great to have you back at WDET in a new way, in a new form, you know? And that's what poetry is. So what is Detroit Youth Poetry Con, especially as you're bringing it back for its second year?
So we're really excited to bring it back this year. It's a convening for a bunch of teens across our Metro Detroit region. So it's a full day of programming. It's free. Today's the last day to register, actually, for teens, and you can do that at our website. But it's a series of creative writing and poetry workshops. There's activities, open mics. There's actually going to be a Best Fit Award. It's an awesome opportunity for young people to come together to express themselves, to learn some skills on how to write, maybe how to perform. There's going to be some improv activities as well. I think the biggest thing is that they come away feeling like they're part of something bigger, that they belong, and that there's community, and that they're part of making that happen. It's really, really cool thing. And then there's the evening public portion as well.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, just hearing that, and I think about a lot of the young kids, they were trapped away, a lot of them early on, maybe early in high school, late in middle school, coming into high school now, where they were trapped in for the pandemic, and they really were just searching for some sense of just community. And you have the Detroit Youth Poetry Con second year. What type of community have you seen grow from the kids, especially after the pandemic?
We asked that we launched this last year. It was the first time we had done it since pre-COVID, of course. Yeah. And we were talking to the young people, and we're like, what do you think? This is cool. And they were very happy to be there. They wanted more. We've done a lot of work to make sure that the programming reflects what they want, which is like the opportunity to create and express themselves and to play with creative writing and poetry. But also this year we've added a lot around what are their potential career paths in creative fields. Like, this is a creative opportunity. You're here creating things, giving back to the community. There's so many things that we don't even think about that are ways that people can thrive in a career and still, work that creative muscle. So they're going to learn a little bit more about that this year too.
I love that so much. I always tell people, like, it does take a creative spirit and personality to do journalism or to be in this particular field, to just kind of come up with things, and you're allowing kids to find that out on their own, but also find that out within a group in a community. And so I love that so much. So we do have Charisma Holly. She's performing her poem, Charisma Speaks of Rivers, at the Union Royal opening. This is a beautiful a little portion here. Go ahead and take it away, Nate.
Water carries ships to its port in waves. Rivers can recall the call and responds by teaching the rest of the earth to sing along. And this community has lived long enough to learn to listen to the river's freedom song. And we never evolved to have teleportation, but we're still alive in this world and in this nation. And isn't that just as powerful? To say that I have been around for a long, long time. I have known rivers ancient, and from it, I've learned to set my mind on resilience and then become it. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. My soul has grown deep like the river. I self-reflect whenever I see my complexion in my wavy blue mirror, and I remind myself that I too have been here. And I am.
When I hear her speak and I hear the passion and the power in her voice, this is a teenager. And I think about all of the other teens that I've been hearing lately, especially Gen Z, just the power they have behind their voices right now. What does that, or how are you all facilitating those voices?
Well, first of all, I have to say I'm a huge fan of Charisma, and she knows that. She's 15, but she's just blowing us all away all the time. And the fun thing is that, like, I truly believe that every person has a voice. They have their own voice, right? And our work is not to give them voice. It is to help them find that voice and then bring it out. So, our mission really at Inside Out is to help young people, inspire and equip them to think critically, create bravely, and share their voices with the world. And so Charisma is a perfect example of that. Like that, finding that, digging deep and finding that bravery and that courage to bring your voice out into the world. I think that has all sorts. It makes society better, actually, when we share who we are with each other.
And it's an amazing thing. I just once again just listening to her. Suma Karaman Rosen is here right now, the executive director of the InsideOut Literary Arts program. And I think about this year's workshop in general, like you were saying, it's working on or focusing on generating new creative writing across multiple genres and career paths. If you can go into that just a little bit more, because you talked about it with journalism being kind of a creative career path. But what are other ways that or other careers that you're showing the teens they can be creative in?
Oh God, sky's the limit. You could wind up in any of the design careers. I like to say that people will not. This whole idea that we're going to have driverless cars at some point, that came from imagination. That's creative. Creative could be, you could be an engineer. You could be a creative healthcare worker and dream up new ways to treat people with things we've been trying to figure out for many, many years. So creativity shows up all over the place. I think once we help young people connect with their own creativity, they can take it anywhere they want to go. I often say we're not in the business. I mean, we serve thousands of kids every year, and we're not in the business of creating poets, although through poetry they learn how to communicate and express themselves, and I think that you can take that anywhere.
And, just expand on that one as well. You're not creating poets, because I think a lot of people assume like, oh, if I do this program, or if I do this or I do that, then I don't really like poetry, so why would I do this or why would I do that program? So give a call to kids or teens or parents who are listening. My kid may not be into poetry, but what are ways that they can engage?
Well, I'd say, first of all, come check it out.
Yeah.
Saturday's a perfect opportunity. It's free. Today's the last day, like I said, for young people to register. Spend a day playing around, move words around on paper. It's the reason why we use poetry is there's such a low barrier for success. Anyone can do it. And then you can continue to get better at it. And we, the other thing that I think is super exciting is that we like to make sure that our young people are exposed to the very best in the field. And so part of what's going to happen on Saturday is we're bringing in the evening portion, which is actually available to the public and is a ticketed event. Our featured guest writer is Ross Gay, who's phenomenal. And we're also going to have Michigan Poet Laureate Nandi Comer. And so these young people are going to be exposed directly with these incredible writers. In fact, part of PoetryCon during the day, the last workshop, everyone comes together with Ross for an expert class with this phenomenal world-class writer. So you can try it, and then you can say, I don't want to be a poet, but I had a really good time, and I learned something about myself, or I made really great connections, and or I want to try it again. There's no real harm in trying a new creative outlet. So yeah. I encourage people to give it a shot. And then for the greater public, I often say that once you come to an Inside Out event, you're going to be hooked. It feels really good. It feels good to be in the room we're going to have some of our teen poets, like Charisma is going to be one of them, performing. We will, of course, have Ross and Nandi in the evening portion. Tickets are available. You can find out more about it on our website, which is InsideOutDetroit.org.
I have just one more question before we let you go here. But, especially you being a former teacher, especially the founder being a former teacher, you're in DPS, or Detroit schools in general, but you're with Detroit students. What are some ways, or how have you seen them grow, especially during your time just working with kids? What's different about these kids in this generation versus 10, 15 years ago?
Oh, that's such a good question. All right, back to I often say you can take the teacher out of the classroom, but you can't take the classroom out of the teacher, or however that goes the other way around, maybe. I think about what my own experiences as a teacher and watching young people find something that they're connected to during the school day, and that can change their entire experience at school. So we often hear from our young people that the experience they had with one of our visiting writers made them want to stick around or learn more, or they carried that feeling of success they had by writing something into whatever the next subject was, math or science or something, and that they were turned on by that experience in such a way that they were able to engage in school. And teachers often tell us that their students are showing up and sharing more and being more participating more, after they have that experience. So I do think that there are ripples, and I think that we're helping make that community somewhere that young people want to be.
I love that so much. The confidence when I hear from the kids who have been in some of these programs, you can just feel it, that they've just like, I didn't know where I was before, but now I have a grasp on where I want to go and and who I am. And that's a great thing to have as a young person, especially as a young Black or brown person. So thank you so much for joining the Metro. Suma Karaman Rosen. Suma is Executive Director of the InsideOut Literary Arts program. This year's event will take place on Saturday, March 9th from 9:30 a.m. until 8:30 p.m. at the Wayne State University Student Center. Admission is free for the day portion. The night portion, one more time for me.
For the general public, tickets are $25. We still have a handful of superfan tickets that are $60 that include a signed copy of Ross's book and a reserved seat. And come and join us.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you.
It is the Metro on 1019 WDET, and coming up, we'll take a look at a new report that highlights information, facts, new info that we have regarding the racial wealth gap. You'll want to hear that, and we'll have more for you when we continue on the Metro.
Welcome back to the Metro on 1019 WDET FM. It's your daily source for news, arts, and culture that's moving Metro Detroit and Detroit. I'm Tia Graham. Nick Austin.
I am Nick Austin here also. As we get into another Detroit-centric topic, What will it take to enhance economic prosperity in Detroit? Tia, this is a question I think about a lot, as I'm sure you're aware of. And this question is pivotal for every Michigan resident, especially when considering that historically large cities have been key engines of prosperity for us in the nation. Yet Detroit faces a significant hurdle: the racial wealth gap. This gap, exacerbated by disparities in home ownership rates and the obstacles to building generational wealth, it's multifaceted, and its resolution is critical, particularly given Detroit's historic distinction as the largest majority Black city in America for over 4 decades, though apparently Memphis might have taken us over. We'll get into that later. But the point is that I want to know, how does the racial wealth gap currently stand, and is it narrowing or widening? And what steps can we undertake to address the issue, not just for the betterment of Detroit and its residents, but the entire state? To explore these questions and potential strategies for progress, we're joined by Kristen Broady, Director of the Economic Mobility Project at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. Kristen, welcome to the Metro.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you too. It's a question I think about a lot. So before we get into what you learned from your study, let us know a little bit more about the Economic Mobility Project at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. What is it, and what are you guys trying to do?
So Dan Sullivan and I are aiming to promote research. There are around 50 economists at the Chicago Fed, and they do really amazing research on topics from student loans to housing, all different sorts of topics. And so we want to promote that research and have as many people read it, understand it, share it with policymakers so that something can be done about all of these things that they're working on.
Yeah, we're going to get into your findings. We're going to get into solutions. But let's just start at this base level. What's the difference between wealth and wages, and why is this distinction important in your study?
Yeah, so wages are what we earn from our jobs, right? It's our hourly wages or our salaries. We get paid every month or, every 2 weeks or however often we get paid, and taxes are taken out. And so that's a kind of flow, right, that the money comes into our account and we use it to purchase goods and services, where wealth is savings, right? So it's all of our assets minus liabilities. So if you think about, whatever loans you have, any credit card debt, you would subtract that out from however much money you have saved. So it's more of a stock, right? This is money that could be passed down in terms of an inheritance to future generations. It could also be used in case one does lose their source of income, those wages, in order to cover bills and tide one through until the next job comes along.
Yeah. And you know what I'm hearing from you, it's kind of like that buffer for risk. Maybe you feel a little bit more confident taking risk. For example, if you're trying to open a business, if you know you have that buffer with wealth versus if you're living from paycheck to paycheck or credit card bill to credit card bill. But let's get into the report then. Before I get into some of the things I'm interested in, what were your overall takeaways that you found in creating your report, Racial Wealth Gains and Gaps, 9 Facts About the Disparities?
So this was the first year that Asian American households were listed as a separate category. Before they were a part of other. And so the data that I'm referencing comes from the 2022 Survey of Consumer Finances. It's a report that comes out from the Fed every 3 years. So in 2022, the U.S. median household income was $192,700. And so just for context, the average Asian American household had a median net worth of $536,000. That's 2.8 times greater than the U.S. median household income, 1.9 times greater than the typical white family's household income at $284,310, 8.6 times greater than the typical Hispanic or Latino American household at $62,120, and 12.2 times greater than the typical Black household that had a net worth of $44,100. So that's just sort of a level setting of what are the numbers that we're talking about and who has the most net worth according to race or ethnicity.
Yeah, but I think people would hear that and wonder what's the significance of that, right? Because if we're breaking that out into a separate category, you know, I've heard from some who say, look, if this category, Asian Americans are able to be so successful after coming over, then that should mean everybody can be successful. How do you break out what's happening here in those numbers then when you have issues of retaining Black wealth or retaining wealth in the Black community as opposed to what you've seen from those numbers?
So we can look at a number of different facts. So if we look at education, Asian Americans have the highest percentage of people who have obtained a bachelor's or master's degree. Research has also found that their households are likely to invest a higher percentage of their wealth on education and also for housing to be able to live in a better school district. But as far as the Survey of Consumer Finances, we can't really look at how the gap has changed for Asian American versus other households because this is the first year that they're listed as a separate group. But if we want to look at the Black-white wealth gap, we would see that the multiplier has been decreasing. So, for instance, it was 9.9 in 2016, 7.8 in 2019, and 6.3 in 2022. So once the survey came out and I was watching the news and reading articles, there were some headlines that reported that it was decreasing. Yeah. But if we look at it in dollar terms, we see that between 2016 and 2019, it increased, right? So it went from 153,850 up to 165,000. And then in 2022, it was 240,000. So we see that over time, the wealth gap between Black and white households is increasing in dollar terms.
Yeah, and I think this is important here because if you're trying to have equity, like I say, like in a city like Detroit, when you're using that wealth as kind of a buffer to increase more economic development, more wage earning, it can be difficult, which is why I want to ask you something specifically from the report, which noted that the racial wealth gap continues to worsen despite increased educational attainment, which we hear about the importance of a 4-year degree, business formation, which we discussed a little bit, and home ownership. There seems to be a disconnect between these two ideas to me. So I ask you, as someone who's looked at the numbers, how is that possible? Why is this gap increasing despite these other things that you noted?
So for a number of reasons, and I guess I'll start with education. I think we saw some fairly staggering numbers there. So if we were to just look at bachelor's or master's degree earnings, we still see inequality, right? So if we look at bachelor's degree earnings, and this is median earnings among 24 to 34-year-old full-time year-round workers with a bachelor's degree, okay? So for white people, it was $65,000. For Black people, $50,000. Hispanic or Latino, $52,000. For Asian Americans, $69,700. So even with a bachelor's degree, we still see these differences by race, right? And so if we think about what do people have to do with that money? So how does education get financed is another thing that we can think about, and we know that one of the ways is loans. So the average amount borrowed as of 4 years after a 2015 or 2016 bachelor's degree completion, and this is for federal loans. For white people, the average amount borrowed was $43,300. For Black people, $58,400. Hispanic or Latino, $41,700. For Asian Americans, $49,100. But what's even more important than that is the amount owed, right? So 4 years later, white people owed 73% of that. Black people owed 105%. Hispanic people owed 84%, and Asian Americans owed 63%. So I want to point out that 105% number. So for African Americans, it says that 4 years later, they owe more than they borrowed in the first place.
Yeah.
So that makes it harder to accumulate wealth. It makes it harder to buy a home, to have a down payment.
Yeah.
All of those things create inequality.
Yeah. And, we will point people to the exact numbers of your study a little bit later on in our website. But before I let you go, as I've got about 30 seconds left, I do want to get into solutions here because you've done a job analyzing the problem, seeing how it manifests itself in the numbers. But you mentioned you're also talking to policymakers out there, and we're looking at potential solutions. So what policy levers or ideas would you have? What would you say to policymakers on things that we could institute right now or places we should be looking, policy changes we can make to try to fix this issue and reduce the wealth gap?
Support for small businesses to help them be successful after 4 years. The 4-year mark is kind of when we look at are they going to continue to make it or not. Continuing to invest in higher education, helping students understand more about loans and how much they're going to owe when they graduate. Job placement definitely is a big thing. Partnerships between higher education institutions and corporate America, the government, and other places that hire college students. Also encouraging people who aren't going to college to maybe go to technical school or increasing support for job training programs.
Mm-hmm. Well, Kristen Broady, again, senior economist and director of the Economic Mobility Project for the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, thanks so much for joining us today on The Metro.
Thank you for having me.
It's The Metro on 101.9 WDET. And coming up, we're going to learn a little bit more about making conservation work more welcoming to Americans.
This is The Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. You just heard from Nick Austin. I am Tia Graham. Taking a look at the weather forecast. Today will be sunny with a high around 74 degrees. We can see winds reaching up to 25 miles per hour today. Tomorrow, Tuesday, will be rainy with a high around 61 degrees. Wednesday will be mostly cloudy with a high near 51, and Thursday partly sunny with a high near 50. Looks like we are entering into our spring phase here in Michigan. And speaking of climate, when people think about conservation and climate defense movements, what are the names that come into your mind? Maybe Swedish activist Greta Thunberg or actor Mark Ruffalo, which is to say that the people considered to be leading the charge to protect the environment are often white. But the people most impacted by climate disasters are Black or brown. These folks are more likely to live closer to power plants or factories, to drink dirty water, or just simply lack access to clean water. There may not be tree-lined streets or little to no access to green spaces. NPR's Julie Deppenbroek spoke with Fred Tutman about his efforts to protect the Maryland River and to make the conservation movement more welcoming.
It's a crisp autumn afternoon, and Fred Tutman is walking along the Patuxent River with his dog.
Yeah, that's River, the dog.
River, the dog, is drinking from the actual river. Ooh.
And there she goes drinking it.
There she goes drinking it. She'll also probably jump in at some point.
Which is not ideal. She'll probably need a bath. That's because the Patuxent is one of the most polluted waterways in the state, scoring a D on the University of Maryland's Chesapeake Bay and Watershed Report Card. Tutman knows this well. He's the Patuxent River Keeper, part of the Waterkeepers Alliance, community advocates charged with protecting waterways all over the world. I ask him about the stretch of river we're looking at right now.
How clean would you say the water here is?
Oh, water quality is far from clean, right?
Over the decades, the Patuxent River has faced pollution from farm runoff, mine waste, and coal-fired power plants. These days, one of the greatest threats is sewage. Tutman points out that there are 36 wastewater treatment plants in the watershed.
And there's hardly a day when there's not a problem or a leak or some kind of a glitch in one of those wastewater treatment plants. That's what's killing the Patuxent more than anything.
Because a glitch at a treatment plant can mean raw, untreated sewage ends up released into the river. Tutman has spent 20 years fighting to clean up problems like this. For him, the fate of the Patuxent is personal. Tutman's family has owned a farm near the river since the 1920s. Growing up, the Patuxent was his swimming hole.
I was pretty much a free spirit out here as a boy. I don't think my mother knew where the heck I was most of the time.
Tutman didn't start out as an environmentalist. He was actually a broadcast journalist. But he says he saw how pollution affected people with less political power. So at the age of 40, he went to law school.
For me, protecting the environment was about fighting over race and class and access and entitlements, none of which I could touch as a journalist, none of which I could touch as a person whose job was to document and tell other people's stories.
In law school, he learned about the river-keeping movement and realized the work he really wanted to do was out in nature. As a riverkeeper, Tutman filed lawsuits against alleged polluters and often won. One of those victories shut down a coal waste disposal site that was contaminating local groundwater. He says the key to his work is building partnerships with communities all along the Patuxent and listening to the people who live there, people who often feel ignored.
I think having the perspective of being a person of color brings you into the ambit of so many people in this watershed who feel frozen out, left out. They feel like they're outsiders.
Tutman has also sometimes felt like an outsider, as a black man working with environmental organizations that are overwhelmingly white, including his own alliance of waterkeepers.
I had at least one waterkeeper say to me, "We let you into this movement and now you want to change everything?"
Tutman says he does want to change things.
To the extent these movements are owned by the people in them, we need more people of color in them. It's just that simple.
He's made that his mission, and he's starting with young people. A couple years ago, he founded a summer camp to introduce kids to the outdoors, especially in communities close to where Tutman himself grew up. About 30 kids participated this past summer.
I'm Abby and I'm 15. I'm Caroline and I'm 13. I'm Carla and I'm 11.
On a rainy day this fall, many of them gathered for a camp reunion and talked about what they'd learned.
How to kayak better and not flip over your kayak. Being able to fish and swim in the river.
I asked Blair Spear, mother of 13-year-old Bryant, whether she had anything like this growing up.
No. No, I didn't get experience like this until I was in my 20s, when I was able to come out and actually learn kayaking for the first time on a Patuxent River.
It's this experience in nature that Tutman wants to share with the kids at camp. And maybe someday they'll put their own stamp on the environmental movement. Because, as Tutman says, when it comes to fixing these rivers,
I think they need all the help they can get, all the new ideas, all the new blood they can possibly get. So here we go.
The call to action from this riverkeeper to the next generation of environmental stewards.
That was NPR's Julie Deppenbrock speaking with Fred Tutman about his efforts to create a more welcoming conservation movement. This is The Metro.
This is the Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Nick Austin along with Tia Graham. And the Supreme Court ruled today that former President Donald Trump will appear on the 2024 presidential primary ballots. Trump previously faced ballot challenges in Chicago, Illinois, and Maine, and was removed from the ballots for attempts to undermine the 2020 election of President Joe Biden. The Supreme Court wrote only Congress has the constitutional power to keep people from appearing on ballots. So Metro on 1019 WDET, as I mentioned, and more conversation, more news, arts, and culture coming your way as we're going to get into a story about convenience stores and gas stations and how they're adapting to the adoption of electric vehicles, right, Tia?
Indeed, Nick. I think about, maybe I want a hybrid, maybe I want an electric car, maybe I want a gas-powered car, but I definitely know the future is telling us EVs are on their way. While that transition to electric vehicles is not as linear as most American car companies want, it is happening. Right now, about 1% of all U.S. vehicles are electric. According to the Edison Electric Institute, it's projected by 2030, at least 10% of all light-duty vehicles will be electric. So what does all this mean for convenience stores at gas stations? What happens when a larger number of drivers don't need gas anymore? How are convenience stores adapting to this moment? Producer Sam Corey spoke with Jeff Leonard, spokesman for the National Association of Convenience Stores, to learn more.
So right now, we're having a lot more electric vehicles come onto our roads and begin to replace gas-powered cars. I'm wondering what this moment is like for convenience stores at gas stations.
It's exciting. It's also nerve-wracking because as you go through a transition, there's things you know and there's things you don't know and there's things you thought you knew and it changes. So with convenience stores that sell fuel, right now about 80% of the fuel is sold at convenience stores across the country. There are about 152,000 convenience stores in the country. 120,000 of them sell fuel. In Michigan, there are 5,000 convenience stores and 4,000 of them sell fuel. So roughly the same percentage. And they have always said they are fuels agnostic. They will sell whatever fuels the customer wants to buy. Now we say we're transportation energy agnostic. We don't care the type of energy that we sell, whatever the customers want. So if it's gas, great. If it's ethanol, great. If it's biodiesel or diesel, great. If it's charging, great.
It's projected that electric vehicles will make up nearly 10% of all light-duty vehicles by 2030. And I do want to acknowledge what you just said about convenience stores being agnostic about what type of fuels are going into the cars, what type of fuels they're providing. But I'm curious if convenience stores are already starting to lose money or are concerned about losing money as more EVs come online.
We have seen a decrease in fuel demand over the last 5 years, and that's really more related to new cars getting better fuel efficiency, particularly the trucks that have really replaced sedans in people's lives. So there has been greater energy efficiency. At the same time, there are more EVs on the road. There's somewhere around 3 million EVs on the road right now, and that's very impressive. They're growing at a 40% clip, also very impressive. On the other hand, there's 290 million vehicles on the roads today that are not EVs, that still use fuel. And if you look at current vehicle sales, there's 15 million new cars sold every year. If you want to replace those 290 million vehicles, it's going to take 20 years of every new car being an EV, and that doesn't take into a lot of factors. So it will be a while before we see EVs have a majority of the vehicles on the road. Certainly they're growing, but it's not at that hockey stick type pace that people talk about where it starts slowly and then ramps up.
I know there's been some problems with charging stations across the country. Some of them don't work. Some of them are just pretty slow, and that most people charge their electric vehicles at their own homes. But I'm curious whether convenience stores are trying to add more charging stations.
The system that was created for how you may or may not charge outside of utilities was created 70 years ago. And that was done before there was even an Interstate Highway Act, the highway system that was created by President Eisenhower. So there are a lot of things that need to be addressed beyond the idea of where do you put a charger, how can we get them in so quickly. And when 2 years ago, there were still half of the states in the country, unless you were a utility, you couldn't charge for electricity. So there's a real disincentive for anybody to want to have a charger at their location, because if you can't make money, you're just giving away a parking spot. And if that charger doesn't work, why do you need to fix it? Because you weren't making any money on it when it was working, so you're not making less money when it's out of service.
I want to push you on this a little bit, though. I mean, there was a lot of
Sure.
money that came down from the Inflation Reduction Act, specifically subsidies for electrification. I'm curious if any of that has made it easier for convenience stores to invest in charging stations.
What that act did was it made it a lot easier to put chargers in. The challenge is, are they the right chargers? Are they maintained? Are they being used? Are they in the right locations? And that is a little bit more difficult than just saying we're going to start installing chargers.
This seems to be a ways out, the way you're describing it. But I am curious if convenience stores are trying to imagine having more fast casual sort of chains, having nicer coffee shops, doing different things to try to attract people if they're less likely to attract them just by offering fuel.
The one thing with convenience stores is they're constantly evolving, because what they sell is they sell convenience, and convenience is a concept. And that concept is defined by the consumer. So if you are not selling the convenience that your customer wants, you're not going to be a convenience store for very long. So we've seen constant evolution of the industry. It used to be way more likely that you can only find packaged items in stores. Right now, if you look at the store, about 26% of in-store sales are food service, which is fresh food or beverages, and it's about 36% of in-store profit. So there's a real move to looking much more like a restaurant that happens to sell fuel or energy than a gas station that happens to sell food.
That was producer Sam Corey speaking with Jeff Leonard, spokesman for the National Association of Convenience Stores. This is The Metro.
That's right, Tia. This is The Metro. I'm Nick Austin. And coming up, why the state Senate voted to ban open carry firearms at polling places when we return on 1019 WDET.
Welcome back to the Metro on 1019 WDET FM. I am Tia Graham. Nick Austin is here as well. And, there are a number of county clerks right now who are concerned about their safety, which is to be believed, and the safety of poll workers when voting comes around, Nick. A lot of things are happening.
Yeah, and that's not for no reason that they have those concerns. Threats against local election officials have increased 75% in recent years, according to a Brennan Center report. That may be why Democrats in the state Senate recently voted to ban the open carry of firearms at polling places. To discuss this bill and whether it will pass, we have Nick Smith with us. He's a reporter for the Gongwer News Service of Michigan. Nick, welcome to the Metro.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, glad that you're here because I've heard about this bill, but I want to know specifically what is the language of the new bill and what kind of exceptions were written into it.
Yeah, so the bills in question are House Bills 4127 and 4128. Basically, they would ban open carry of firearms inside of polling places on Election Day and during the 40-day period for casting absentee ballots or within 100 feet of the locations. This would be the polling locations, near absentee ballot drop box sites, clerk's offices, and the absentee ballot counting board sites following elections. There were some exceptions that the Senate put into the bills before final passage last Thursday. basically would allow for off-duty officers to also be able to conceal carry. Other exceptions would include if someone had safely stored their vehicle inside of their car, parked, gone up to vote, or if someone has a residence nearby one of these locations, if someone who has a permit to be able to carry goes to or from a residence that's within that radius.
All right. Well, one of the things I heard there is a distinction with concealment, which wasn't necessarily mentioned in the bill. How does it operate with just standard concealed carry that you haven't discussed, like, for example, with police officers? Does that mean that those are allowed, or is there another bill that already took care of them? Where does that fit into this?
Well, in my reading in the language of the bill, it does say a person carrying a concealed pistol if the person is licensed by the state or another state to carry a concealed pistol. So from our understanding, talking with the chair of the Senate Elections Committee after the votes, reporters were told that this largely deals with open display, such as walking around, just flouting the fact that you have an open carry gun, and that could potentially intimidate individuals. So this bill largely deals with open carry.
Yeah. And what are the penalties for violating it?
Penalties are actually relatively minor. They would be a misdemeanor with a maximum penalty of up to 90 days in jail and a $100 fine or both. So it's relatively minor for the offense, but yeah.
Yeah. And Republicans decided to not vote on this bill. It went through on party lines. Why do you think Republicans decided not to go ahead with this? And could there be any difference in the House?
Well, they seem to kind of basically wanted to go along with the complaints that were raised in committee by opponents of the various gun organizations. Generally speaking, on Second Amendment grounds, they also brought up an interesting theoretical situation of large numbers of people could end up getting misdemeanors on their records by simply walking around near a absentee drop box site or something, not being aware of the law and possibly getting nailed for that. So they brought up similar such complaints during the very brief floor debate.
All right. Well, how likely is it for this to pass the House and get signed by Governor Whitmer? Do we expect that could happen? And what kind of timeline are we looking at?
Well, the House probably will not be bringing this bill up until at least April. There's obviously the 54-54 partisan tie in the House right now with two vacancies, both strongly Democratic Detroit area seats. So when the special elections on these are done and these two members are seated, they would probably bring up this bill at some point afterward. They would need a final concurrence vote, and from there they'd be able to send it to the governor. And with past gun legislation largely passed along party lines, I would have to hazard a guess that the governor might be more inclined to sign it, as they did with stuff last year. At this point,
we'll keep an eye on this as well. Nick Smith, reporter with Gongwer News Service of Michigan. Thanks for joining us on the Metro. This is the Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. I'm Nick Austin, along with Tia Graham.
Indeed you are. And coming up on the Metro, we'll talk about a new report that explains why a number of inherited Detroit properties are at risk of tax foreclosure. You all stay right there.
It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET. I'm Nick Austin.
And I am Tia Graham. And one of the themes we've heard from on the show today was home ownership, especially black home ownership. A new Detroit Future City report found that more than 5,000 Detroit properties are not legally owned by the families who inherited them. The think tank believes that that's a problem because those properties, concentrated in legacy black neighborhoods, make tax foreclosure all the more likely. As it stands, 10% of the mentioned properties are now at risk of foreclosure. WDET's Amanda LeClaire spoke with Ashley Williams-Clark of Detroit Future City about the issue.
The scope of the report is that we wanted to get a better sense of properties that are inherited through generations, but didn't go through the probate process or have a will attached to them. So they didn't have legal proof of transfer of ownership.
I didn't know that happened a lot.
So it was really interesting, as we think about Detroit Future City's work and as we think about creating more thriving, resilient neighborhoods, and we think about how do we create more Black middle-class households and support homeownership in the city, we've been diving a lot in our own work into things like homeownership rates and mortgage originations. And this concept of income and wealth building is really critical to all of that. And so we were intrigued when the Gilbert Family Foundation reached out to us with this problem that they were seeing in their work, which is that people were going to access critical resources like tax foreclosure prevention or the Hope property tax exemption and finding out that they didn't actually own the house that they had been living in and that they thought that they had inherited from a family member. And so what was really critical about this study is that we were able to look at tax assessment data, ping it against death records, and find out that there are over 5,525 properties in Detroit where all the people who are listed on the assessor's data are actually deceased. So it's an issue in the city, and it's important in terms of thinking about how do we preserve that intergenerational transfer of wealth as well as household stability.
And that intergenerational wealth accumulation in that way is a huge part of the American middle class, the building of it in mid-last century. And it's something a lot of Black families were kept out of due to housing discrimination laws in the U.S. and especially here in Detroit.
It's critically important. And also, many Black households haven't had equitable access to the legal system either. And so when we looked at those 5,500 plus properties, we found out that they were estimated at over $270 million in value. And so when we talk about the number of properties, it might not seem as significant in the grand scheme of Detroit. But when we talk about that wealth component and that intergenerational transfer of wealth, $270 million is pretty significant. And it's an issue that does not just impact low-income Detroiters. It impacts everybody. Anybody who owns a home or has a family member that owns a home, if there isn't a will or if somebody hasn't gone through that probate process, that home is at risk of being an heir's property. And so it's really critically important as we talk about that wealth transfer and wealth creation.
According to the report, how many heirs' properties are at risk of tax foreclosure this year? And what will be required for residents to avoid it?
So we found that there were 496 properties that were currently at risk of tax foreclosure that we identified as heirs properties. And I think as we think about solutions and ways to support the people who live in those properties, it's working through trusted community partners around outreach and helping them get connected to legal resources that can help them secure the property. And in some of the neighborhoods or census tracts where we saw the highest concentrations of heirs properties, we saw the highest share of Black population. We saw higher home ownership rates. We saw higher average median home sales prices. So again, pointing to the fact that a lot of these neighborhoods where we are seeing heirs properties are in legacy Black middle-class neighborhoods.
That was Ashley Williams-Clark, director of the Center for Equity, Engagement, and Research at Detroit Future City. She spoke with WDET's Amanda LeClaire.
And this is the Metro on 101.9 WDET. You just heard from Tia Graham. I'm Nick Austin, but the director of music on WDET at noon with In the Groove is your host, Ryan Patrick Hooper. Ryan, what's coming up?
Man, that's an exciting new title, Director of Music. We got a ton of great new music ahead. It's going to be quite an eclectic mix. I've also got the last pair of tickets to see the National and War on Drugs. We're going to give those away, so you definitely want to stay tuned for that. But Tia and Nick, I do have to give a major shout out to all the bands, all the people that made Hamtramck Blowout over this past weekend. So incredible. I have fallen in love with local music all over again. That beautiful grassroots effort deserves all the love. Great new music coming up on In the Groove, Nick and Tia.
You know, I'm just thinking, like, when did you ever fall out of love with it? You are local music, Ryan.
I know, but heartbreak, you break up, you get back together. You know how it goes. Yeah. These streets unforgiving.
Nick.
That's going to do it for March 4th. 2024 edition of the Metro. You can listen to recent episodes online at WDET.org and make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform.
The show is produced by Sam Corey, David Lyons, and Jack Philbrandt. Our technical director is Nate Bender. Music is done by Sam Bobian. Our news director is Jerome Vaughn, and our program director is Adam Fox.
The Metro is a WDET production, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University. If you like what you hear and want to support the Metro, consider becoming a member at WDET.org/donate.
This is WDET FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. See you tomorrow.